The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open slowly as 5-year-old Lily Thompson stepped inside, her tiny hand gripping tightly to the leash of a large German shepherd named Max. The hush that fell over the room was immediate as every eye turned to the small girl moving nervously across the floor. Though petite and fragile in appearance, there was a quiet determination in Lily's movements as she walked toward the witness stand, each step seemingly heavier than the last. Dressed in a pale yellow dress with her curly hair tucked neatly behind her ears, Lily appeared more like a child heading to her first recital than someone carrying the weight of a high-profile legal case. Sitting on the bench, Judge William Parker, a man whose decades on the bench had exposed him to every variety of human drama, leaned forward slightly, recognizing the significance of this moment. Everyone knew this child was not just a witness, she was the witness. Lily was the sole person to have seen the man who attempted to abduct her in broad daylight. But ever since that terrifying day, she hadn't spoken a single word. Her silence was not just a challenge for the prosecution, it was the defense's greatest advantage. On the other side of the courtroom, Brian Cooper sat calmly at the defense table beside his attorney. At 47, the software engineer had a disarmingly average appearance, clean-cut, soft-spoken, and outwardly composed. But those who had worked the case knew appearances could be dangerously misleading. Cooper had been placed at the scene of Lily's abduction attempt by a witness, but no physical evidence had tied him to the crime. His defense leaned heavily on discrediting the traumatized girl's ability to identify him, especially since she couldn't or wouldn't speak. As Lily reached the witness stand and carefully climbed onto the seat, her eyes met Cooper's for the first time since that horrific day. A tension passed through her body, barely visible to most in the room, but not to Max, and not to Judge Parker. Lily's small hand trembled slightly before making a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a movement developed during weeks of therapy, one that served as a secret signal between her and Max, meant to communicate her distress or recognition without speaking. To the untrained eye, it could have been dismissed as a nervous tic. But Max's reaction was immediate and intense. The moment Lily's fingers shifted, the dog's body snapped to alert his ears, perked forward, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition. The courtroom stirred. A murmur spread through the gallery as people exchanged puzzled and concerned glances. This wasn't a standard therapy dog, simply responding to a frightened child. This was something else entirely. Max's gaze locked unflinchingly onto Cooper, his body tense as though he were ready to spring into action. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, and for the first time Judge Parker's gavel came down not to silence a disorderly crowd, but to acknowledge something extraordinary. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice clipped with urgency. The attorneys looked at him in confusion, but he didn't explain. His eyes remained on Lily and Max, the image of that synchronized, silent communication lingering in his mind like a clue begging to be unraveled. Outside the courtroom, Judge Parker remained seated as the room cleared. He tapped his fingers against the bench, deep in thought. He had witnessed a lot in his years presiding over criminal trials, outbursts, confessions, dramatic reveals, but never had he seen a therapy animal react with such clarity and intensity. The look in Max's eyes was not simply protective, it was accusatory, pointed and disturbingly certain. The judge's instincts, sharpened by decades of observing human behavior, told him they had just witnessed a turning point. Whether it could hold up in court was still to be determined, but emotionally the tide had shifted. Something in that moment, Lily's gesture, Max's response, Cooper's fleeting flicker of unease, had pierced the silence of doubt. Meanwhile, in the defense's private room, Brian Cooper's composed facade began to slip. The moment the door closed behind him, and his lawyer Cooper's fingers drummed nervously against the table. "She knows," he muttered to himself. His attorney, Michael Grant, raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" Cooper quickly shook his head, forcing a tight smile. Nothing but his mind was spinning. He had underestimated the dog. He hadn't considered that Max might remember him, or worse, that the child's bond with the dog would compensate for her silence. For the first time since his arrest, fear crept into his expression. The silence that had once been his ally was now filled with suspicion, and the eyes of a German shepherd who just might tear his defense apart. It was a warm, breezy afternoon in the suburbs of Pinebrook, the kind of spring day when the air smelled of lilacs, and the golden sun filtered softly through the budding trees. In the backyard of a modest home on Cedar Lane, 5-year-old Lily Thompson twirled barefoot in the grass, her pink dress spinning like petals around her. Her mother, Rachel Thompson, stood by the kitchen window, smiling faintly as she watched her daughter's carefree movements. The scene was peaceful, the kind of ordinary day that should have ended in bedtime stories and chocolate chip cookies, but all it took was 4 minutes of phone call from Rachel's sister, a quick step inside the house, and everything changed. When Rachel returned to the yard, the gate stood ajar. Panic surged through her as she spotted Lily frozen near the sidewalk, her wide eyes locked on a man crouched beside her. He was smiling too warmly, holding out a hand. "I have puppies in my van," he said, his voice slick. "They need a little girl to take care of them, want to see Rachel's screams slice through the air like a siren." "Lily," the man's head snapped toward the house, his grin evaporating into a steely grimace. In that split second of distraction, Lily stood paralyzed, unable to run or even cry. It was only when a neighbor, Mrs. Helen Brooks, a retired nurse walking her beagle across the street, shouted with surprising authority, "Hey, get away from that child," that the spell broke. The man's grip loosened. Lily yanked free and bolted back toward her mother, who scooped her up just as a black van screeched away from the curb, leaving a trail of rubber and fear. Clutching Lily to her chest, Rachel felt her daughter's tiny body trembling violently, but Lily said nothing, not a word. Her face buried in her mother's shoulder, she shook silent as the sirens that wailed in the distance. The police arrived within minutes, followed by federal agents from the Child Abduction Task Force. Lead investigator Thomas Reynolds quickly took charge, his weathered face and seasoned instincts sharpening as he surveyed the scene. The van matched a partial description linked to 3 prior abduction attempts in nearby towns. "He fits the profile," Reynolds muttered grimly, reviewing his worn notebook. His partner, Agent Lisa Monroe, knelt beside Lily, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the man looked like?" But Lily didn't respond. She didn't nod, shake her head, or even blink. Rachel, barely holding herself together, whispered, "She hasn't said a word since I picked her up." The diagnosis came swiftly. Selective mutism, a psychological shutdown triggered by severe trauma. The case moved forward, but without Lily's voice, the prosecution lacked its strongest evidence. In the days that followed, the Thompsons' once joyful home transformed into a quiet and tense space. Lily, once a constant stream of stories and laughter, now sat in silence, curled up in corners, flinching at every unfamiliar sound. She stopped playing with her toys. She wouldn't touch her favorite books. Even her beloved stuffed bunny was abandoned on the bedroom floor. James Thompson tried to keep life normal, making pancakes in the mornings, tucking Lily in at night, but she wouldn't engage. Rachel spent sleepless nights reading articles, researching trauma therapy, desperate for anything that might help their daughter come back to them. Each night, Lily's sleep was haunted by silent nightmares. Her small body thrashed beneath the covers, but her voice never emerged, just gasps and trembling. The little girl who once filled every room with sunshine was slipping further into the shadows. One late evening, sitting at the kitchen table with tear-streaked cheeks and a cup of untouched tea, Rachel looked across at her husband. The therapist suggested a support animal. She said softly. James looked exhausted. "Like a service dog?" he asked. "More like a therapy dog," she clarified. "Someone to help her feel safe again. Someone she can trust." They both knew it was a long shot, but they were willing to try anything. Enter Max. At Dr. Laura Bennett's Rehabilitation Center for Retired Police Dogs, they met the dog who would unknowingly begin to heal their daughter Max, a once celebrated K-9 unit officer bore a long scar down his right flank from a knife wound sustained during a child rescue operation 3 years earlier. He had been deemed too injured for active duty and was set to be euthanized until Dr. Bennett fought to adopt him, believing his loyalty and instincts still had value. Rachel and Lily arrived at the center the following week. Lily, as always, was silent, hiding behind her mother's legs. Dr. Bennett knelt beside her and said, "Max helps kids who've been through scary things. You don't have to talk, just watch." Max didn't rush toward Lily. He sat quietly alert, but gentle, letting her observe. Minutes passed, then slowly, so slowly, Lily stepped forward. Her tiny hand hovered uncertain, then lowered to brush his fur. That simple touch was the first physical connection she'd made in 2 weeks. Rachel gasped, tears filling her eyes. Max didn't move, except to gently nuzzle against the girl's palm. It wasn't just a meeting. It was the first fragile stitch in a long journey of healing, woven not with words but with instinct, trust, and a bond that only a child and a dog could understand. From the moment Max brushed his warm nose against Lily's hand at Dr. Bennett's center, something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than comfort. It was as if the retired police dog recognized a kindred soul, someone else who had been wounded and silenced by fear. In the days that followed, Max was brought home, and he quickly became Lily's shadow. He never left her side, following her from room to room, sitting patiently at her feet and lying next to her bed every night. When the nightmares came, and they came, often Max would nuzzle against her until she calmed sometimes, resting his head over her legs as if to shield her from invisible harm. Lily no longer screamed or thrashed silently in her sleep. Instead, she would reach out instinctively, burying her fingers in his fur like an anchor in a storm. It wasn't magic. It was something stronger, trust forged in silence. With Max around, small miracles began to unfold. One morning, Rachel walked past Lily's room and froze in the doorway. Her daughter was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a crayon in hand, sketching a figure that resembled a dog beside a little girl. The colors were vivid blue skies, green grass, and in the center Max with his scar drawn in careful detail. It was the first time Lily had picked up her crayons in weeks. Rachel quietly backed away, tears springing to her eyes. Over the next few days, more drawings appeared: a girl and a dog standing together against dark shadows, hiding in a forest, walking through sunlit fields. It was through these images that Lily began telling her story. Then came the whisper. It was barely audible, more breath than voice. "Good boy," she said one afternoon, watching Max roll over during a training game. Rachel, who had been watching from the kitchen, dropped her coffee cup and rushed into the room. "Lily?" she asked, voice trembling, but the little girl just smiled faintly and returned her attention to Max, whispering it again. Good boy Dr. Bennett, upon hearing the news, offered cautious optimism. When a child begins to speak again, it usually comes in whispers in safe places. She's not ready to tell her story with words yet, but this is a start. With guidance from her therapist and the continued presence of Max, Lily's world slowly began to reopen. She started responding with nods, then one-word answers. Sometimes, during quiet moments, she would describe Max's actions in soft, fragmented phrases. Her parents, once desperate and exhausted, now clung to every word as if it were a treasure. Max remained the bridge, never asking anything of her, simply being there. And that presence, patient and loyal, did more than any medicine or therapy session could. Max was her voice before she could find her own, but as Lily's healing continued at home, the courtroom loomed ahead. Despite her progress, the legal process moved forward, and Lily would need to return to face the man who had stolen her innocence. The court had allowed Max to accompany her, acknowledging his role as a medical support animal, but it quickly became apparent that his role was more than emotional support. Each time Brian Cooper entered the courtroom, Max's demeanor shifted. His ears twitched, his body stiffened, and a low, almost imperceptible growl rumbled from his chest. He never lunged, never barked, but he locked eyes with Cooper every time, unmoving and intense. It wasn't just protection. It was recognition. A recognition that investigators could no longer ignore. Judge William Parker took particular notice. A man not easily swayed by theatrics, Parker began documenting the precise moments of Max's behavioral changes. He consulted with the prosecution and requested expert analysis of animal behavior, hoping to understand what exactly the dog was reacting to. Meanwhile, FBI agent Thomas Reynolds quietly observed the pattern. "That dog knows something," he murmured to his partner after one tense exchange in court, "and if he does, it means she does too." For the first time in the case, Lily's silence was not a barrier. It was a signal. Through Max, she was speaking volumes, and those paying attention were beginning to hear her. As Max's reactions grew more consistent, the defense grew more uncomfortable. Cooper, once confident and smug, began to falter. His eyes darted toward Max more often, and his hands, once steady, began to tremble at the sight of the dog. The courtroom dynamic shifted. Jurors began whispering. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Lily, while still quiet, sat taller beside Max, her fingers now wrapped around his leash, not out of fear but out of quiet resolve. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no outbursts, no cries of revelation, but in the way Max sat, in the way. Lily met Cooper's gaze without shrinking. The truth was beginning to surface one steady breath at a time. The courtroom was still buzzing from Max's most recent reaction. His ears' rigid body coiled and gaze locked unwaveringly on Brian Cooper when the prosecution team made a bold decision. With pressure mounting and public interest surging, they pushed for a forensic re-examination of every piece of circumstantial evidence they had previously considered dead ends. One such lead was a set of soil samples recovered from the underside of Cooper's van. The samples, largely ignored, until now were sent to the state crime lab for advanced analysis. Within 48 hours, the results came back. The soil contained traces of decomposing organic matter, pine pollen, and specific fungal spores found only in a narrow stretch of forested land 2 hours north of Pine Brook. That region, rarely visited and long abandoned by most locals, held something the investigation had been missing, a destination that might explain everything. Agent Thomas Reynolds, who had led countless child abduction cases throughout his career, immediately knew what needed to be done. "We're going," he told his team, "and Max is coming with us." They arrived at the edge of the forest just after noon. The sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting scattered light on a narrow dirt path overrun with weeds. Max stepped out of the unmarked vehicle, first, his nose immediately twitching. He sniffed. The air took several slow steps and paused. His body stiffened, tail raised, not in excitement, but in high alert. Reynolds took note of every signal, silently grateful that this dog had been allowed back into service, even unofficially. As the team followed Max's lead, the path grew narrower and the woods quieter, until finally, through a break in the trees, they saw it, a run-down cabin with a sagging roof and dust-covered windows. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But the faint tire tracks leading to the side of the porch and a disturbed patch of earth near the back told a different story. Someone had been here recently. Max stopped at the front door, his growl low and steady. Reynolds signaled his team to draw their weapons. They entered with caution, clearing room by room. The interior was sparse: a single cot, a small table, empty, canned goods, and a lantern that had run out of oil. It almost looked like a hunting outpost or a squatter's shelter, until Max moved to the far corner of the cabin and refused to budge. His paws scraped at the wooden floorboards. Nose pressed to a faint seam in the wood, Reynolds knelt beside him and tapped. Hollow. "There's something under here," he muttered. With the help of another agent, the floorboards were pried loose, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into complete darkness. A stench rose from below, damp, musty, and unmistakably human. With flashlights drawn and hearts pounding, the team descended into the hidden basement. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, revealing a chilling scene. Children's belongings littered the corners: stuffed animals, old shoes, a pink backpack faded by time. But what froze the agents in place was the sight of a girl curled up in the farthest corner, her ankles shackled to a steel chain bolted to the wall. Her hair was matted, her skin pale, and her clothes torn, but her eyes widened with fragile hope as the light fell on her face. "Help!" she croaked, voice cracked from disuse. "Please!" Agent Reynolds rushed forward, unlocking the chain and lifting her into his arms. "You're safe now," he whispered. "We've got you." The girl was identified as Sophia Green, the 8-year-old who had been missing for over 6 months. Max whined and circled near her, as if sensing the weight of what she had endured. Sophia reached out with trembling fingers to touch his head. It was the first time she had smiled in months. The cabin was immediately secured, and forensic specialists arrived within hours. Tire treads around the perimeter matched the pattern from Cooper's van with chilling precision. DNA samples were collected from the basement, and the chain traces of both Cooper's skin cells and Sophia's were found. It was the confirmation they needed, the final puzzle piece that transformed suspicion into undeniable fact. Back in Pinebrook, news of the discovery spread like wildfire. The courtroom, already filled with anticipation, now brimmed with stunned silence as the prosecution revealed their findings. Agent Reynolds delivered the report personally. "Sophia Green is alive," he said, his voice steady. "She identified Brian Cooper as her abductor, and the soil in his van brought us to her." Cooper's defense team scrambled. Attorney Michael Grant filed motions to suppress the new evidence citing timing and relevance, but the court denied them all. Judge William Parker reviewed the full report in chambers and returned to the bench with a hardened expression. "The court recognizes the new forensic evidence and the recovered victim as material to this trial." He stated the tide had turned irrevocably. What had once been a battle of silence versus reason had now become a cascade of truth. Cooper, once confident and composed, sat slumped at the defense table, eyes hollow, fingers twitching nervously. His entire strategy, built on the idea that Lily Thompson couldn't speak, was crumbling. Now it wasn't just her memory. It was another little girl's survival, a dog's instinct, a trail of soil, and it was all leading to one man. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, the tension so thick it seemed to weigh on everyone's shoulders. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens frozen, mid-sentence eyes locked on the defendant's table. Brian Cooper sat pale and sweating no longer, the confident, smug figure who had entered this trial believing the silence of a child would protect him. The evidence from the cabin had shattered any illusion of innocence. And now, as Max sat beside Lily at the witness stand, eyes sharp posture, alert, his steady gaze bore into Cooper with the quiet force of undeniable truth. The room had grown silent again, not out of respect, but anticipation. Something was building. The kind of moment you didn't see coming yet somehow felt inevitable. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward the exit as if considering flight. Then Max let out a low growl, not threatening, not loud, but final. The sound echoed in the courtroom like a bell tolling. Cooper's hands began to tremble. His lips parted as if he were about to speak but couldn't find the words. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but Cooper wasn't listening. He stared at Max, at Lily, at the jury, and finally at Judge William Parker. Slowly he stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice weak and broken. "I want to change my plea." Gasps filled the chamber. His lawyer turned to him in shock, trying to intervene, but Cooper continued, "Guilty to everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Max stopped growling, simply watching as if he too had been waiting for the truth to be spoken aloud. The judge's gavel came down with authority, calling the court back to order. "Let the record show that the defendant, Brian Cooper, has pleaded guilty to all charges." The proceedings moved swiftly after that. Victim impact statements were read. The prosecution presented their final evidence, including DNA from the cabin, the confirmed identity of Sophia Green, and Max's behavioral reports. Judge Parker, known for his composed and restrained demeanor, did not hide the emotion in his voice as he delivered the sentence, "For the crimes of attempted abduction, unlawful imprisonment, and the endangerment of minors, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A wave of collective relief rippled through the courtroom. Sophia Green's parents wept openly. Rachel and James Thompson held hands tightly, silent tears streaming down their cheeks, and Lily, still silent, sat quietly beside Max, her small hand resting on his head. As the courtroom emptied, people paused to glance one last time at the little girl and the dog who had changed everything. Max remained still calm in the chaos, as if knowing his job was almost done. Lily took a tentative step forward, and then knelt beside him. Her hands gently cupped his face, and for a moment it was just the two of them. Her lips moved softly, and for the first time since the closing arguments began, her voice returned. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 words, simple, pure, powerful. Her parents watched, overwhelmed with emotion, knowing those words weren't just for Max. They were the beginning of something new, a sign that the little girl they feared they had lost was finding her way back. Dr. Bennett, seated quietly in the back, placed a hand over her heart. She had always believed in the healing potential of animals, but Max had done more than comfort. He had protected, guided, and spoken for someone who had no voice, and in doing so, he had helped put a predator behind bars. Back at home, Lily slowly returned to her routines, drawing, reading, and even laughing on occasion. The nightmares still came, but they were different now. When they woke her, Max was always there, and so were her words. She could say she was scared, she could say she needed help, and that in itself was everything. In the years that followed, the story of Lily and Max became more than a courtroom drama. It became a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, and of how even the smallest voice, when paired with unwavering loyalty, can change the course of justice. Max was never just a dog. He was a guardian, a companion, a voice in the silence. And Lily, the silent witness who once trembled in fear, had become a survivor with a story that needed no embellishment. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the crime, it was about the bond that healed it. If this story moved, you don't forget to support Deep Inside HQ by subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell so you never miss our most powerful stories. We share real and inspiring tales that reveal the strength of the human spirit, and sometimes the quiet heroes who walk beside us on 4 legs. Leave a comment below to let us know what part of Lily and Max's journey touched you most, and share this video with someone who believes in justice, healing, and the silent courage that can change the world.